So today we have a very nice guest, Selin Gülgöz, who is an assistant professor at Fordham University. So thank you very much for joining us, Selin.
Thanks for inviting me.
All right, so today we're going to talk about, well, research on transgender children, transgender prejudices more broadly, and in particular, one of your papers that recently came out. But I'd like to start these out by just asking more generally, what are the research questions that guide your work?
Yeah, so I primarily am interested in how children reason about social categories. So my research to date has specifically focused on how children reason about gender categories. And I have been interested in this question of to what extent do children essentialize gender? Meaning, to what extent do they view gender as something that's inborn and something that can't change? And more importantly, something that is inherent to an individual and determines or predicts their other characteristics like their preferences, the way they're going to behave, the way they're going to interact in society with other people. So this idea that men and women are the two binary discrete categories of gender that we have, and they are inherently and essentially different from each other. And the difference is so natural that it's something that we can't change, and that it's something that predicts male typed or female typed behaviors and preferences. All of these are beliefs that people tend to have. I'm not saying that they're what is actually true, but so I've been interested in how children reason about these groups. And I became interested in how transgender and more broadly gender nonconforming children are reasoning about gender as well, because from an outsider's point of view, it may seem that transgender children, for example, so here I'm talking about children who have socially transitioned to live and present as a gender that's different from what they were assigned to at birth. So someone might think that these kids are so essentialist that they're not comfortable with that sort of middle point of being in between a boy and a girl, and they might think that it's almost more acceptable to be one of the binary genders. Again, I'm not saying that this is true, but from an outsider's point of view, and for someone who hasn't really studied trans and gender nonconforming identities yet, that might be how it seems. And so at the time, there was little to no research done with transgender children. So that's how I became interested in those questions.
Very interesting. I mean, I guess you're jumping off of that. Before we get into the specifics of their paper, but basically looking at the existing research on transgender children, if you have the opportunity now to clarify what you think is the biggest misconception about this population or this area of research, is that something you could do right now?
Well, there are definitely a few. One of them is, I think, at least in the general population, one misconception is that when we talk about transgender children, so again, children who have socially transitioned, a lot of people worry that these kids have had medical interventions done to them or hormonal interventions. And this is actually not true. When we talk about socially transitioned children or transgender children, what we're talking about is simply children who say to their parents in a very persistent and consistent way that they are a different gender, and whose parents support them to change their pronouns from he to she, for example, often their names and their appearances to align better with what is typically associated with the gender that they identify as. And so what happens is transgender children end up living and presenting as the gender they identify with, and so are treated by others around them as that gender, as opposed to the gender they were assigned to at birth, but no medical interventions are involved at that age. So this is the age, when I talk about children, I'm talking about prepubescent children. And so there's no medical intervention at that point.
Yes, thank you for clarifying.
So I think that's one of the
Yeah.
misconceptions.
Can you talk a little bit about the recruitment efforts that are needed to complete these studies? So one of the things that I find most impressive about this whole project is, aside from the clear relevance of this work and the novelty of it, is just like the literal investment and time that's needed to complete these samples. So can you talk a little bit about actually how these studies are done?
Yeah, definitely. So the study, the paper that you're mentioning, the most recent paper, is part of a larger longitudinal study called the TransYouth Project. And it was started by Dr. Christina Olson, who is a professor of psychology at the University of Washington, and that's where the project started. And the goal was initially to recruit 3 to 12-year-old transgender children from across the US and Canada, mostly because those are our access points. And so, like you said, a lot of funding is necessary for this. So it started off pretty small. We recruit participants through online and in-person support groups for families with transgender or gender non-conforming children, through conferences geared towards families who have gender diverse children. And then eventually what started happening was word of mouth. As families started participating in our study, a lot of families would hear about them and just contact us through our website and showing interest in participating. And once participants have signed up, we travel to wherever they are and meet with them in person, often in their homes, sometimes in a public location, like a private spot in a public location, like a rented room in a public library. And meet with the family for about an hour, hour and a half, where we do testing with both the transgender children, if there's any cisgender sibling willing to participate who's also within the age ranges that we're interested in, which is 3 to 12-year-olds. They would also participate, and then we would also run some measures with the parents as well. So it's been a very interesting project, nothing like I've ever worked on before, because especially when we go to participants' homes, we get to see where they live, how their what their environment is like, and I should say it's been a very positive and warm experience. Everyone has been incredibly welcoming, and it's just a very, as you know, as cognitive psychologists or developmental psychologists, we very rarely see the home environment and get to spend so much time with our participants. So it's been very interesting. Even though we say the studies about transgender children, we have also recruited gender non-conforming children. And both of these terms are used differently in different environments. But when we talk about transgender in this particular study, we use that to operationally define, we operationally define it as referring to children, like I mentioned, who use a pronoun that's different from what they were assigned to at birth. Whereas our gender nonconforming group are kids who have been identified by their parents as showing either something about their gender identity or their gender typed preferences that are not aligned with what is typically associated with their gender. But these kids have not socially transitioned, so they're still using either the pronouns that they were assigned to at birth, or they're using pronouns that might be more gender neutral, like they, them.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so we can talk more about them if you'd be interested as well. But I just wanted to let you know that we have those two groups in our study.
Right. Yes. And this is a note to future Jordan to also review the papers that are focusing on these gender non-conforming children as well. So before, I guess I want to zero in a little bit on some of the specific results from your paper. In one way, it's a very straightforward paper because there's so much similarity in the measures of gender cognition or gender identity between the transgender and cisgender children that it's very straightforward. But one finding that I wanted to get your reaction to was the lack of a correlation between time spent transitioning and performance on these gender identity measures. I found this surprising. I think that for a lot of other social groups, maybe we would actually expect to find that effect. Like if you convert to a new religion, maybe your association with that religion only becomes stronger and stronger over time, but you didn't find that in your paper. Yeah. So obviously you can't give me the real reason, the knowable reason why, but I wanted you to speculate. What do you think is the best explanation for that lack of correlation? For that lack of
Right, I agree. It's incredibly interesting, the finding that there's no correlation between how long a child has spent after having transitioned, meaning living and presenting and being treated as this sort of quote unquote new gender, and to what extent they show those gender typed preferences. The way we've interpreted this finding is that it might indicate that it's not the act of socially transitioning itself that is driving children's gender typed preferences or behaviors. So in other words, it's not that all of a sudden after I've socially transitioned, people are treating me as a girl and I present as a girl and everyone thinks that I'm a girl. So I go out and start showing more strongly quote unquote girl preferences, wanting to play with toys that girls typically want to play with and so on. But rather that those preferences were already there with or without the social transition. And in a way, the social transition doesn't necessarily facilitate the extremity or the strength of those gender typed preferences. So this is, again, there are some, earlier you asked about some of the misconceptions, and there are some concerns, which, it makes sense because we're talking about young children and making big decisions, but there are some concerns about these early social transitions in the sense that they might sort of solidify children's sort of wavering gender identities. But actually, I think what this finding, along with other findings from other studies, shows is that the social transition doesn't necessarily have an effect over the extremity of children's identification or their gender typed characteristics.
Very interesting. So it's almost as if the social transition is something that you can clearly mark and note from a measurement perspective, but it's really it's almost the endpoint of a different process that we're not necessarily picking up on. Is that fair to say? It's almost like we're conceiving of the social transition as some sort of starting point, but really it's much farther along this whole process.
Yeah, I think that's an accurate way to describe it.
Okay, great. So I wanted to ask you about the eligibility to participate in these studies. So it seems like the eligibility might be a little strict for reasons that make a lot of sense. But so for example, it seems like in order to be eligible to participate in the study as a transgender child, all the family members in that child's home or family need to be using pronouns opposite of the sex assigned at birth. And so I wonder if, unfortunately, that there are a lot of transgender children who don't receive that kind of support at home, and they're not eligible or able to participate in your studies, and whether that might be introducing some kind of selection effect. And so if you were able to include those types of children in your studies, we might see different results from what you're seeing from maybe students or children from more supportive backgrounds.
Yeah, that is definitely probably the biggest limitation of the study, that the kids in our sample are highly supported by their parents. And of course, there is some variation in the extent to which parents are supportive, but overall, we can say that they're very highly supportive. And you know, one of the reasons for having this limitation is because we were interested in working with children who had socially transitioned. And to be able to socially transition, you inevitably need parental support. For a young child to be able to change their pronouns, change their appearance, change their name, and basically tell the world that they should treat them as a different gender, they certainly need their parents' support and guidance through that process. So we needed to recruit children who had that support to be able to see what the development of gender identity looked like in kids who had socially transitioned. Now, you're absolutely right to think that there are tons of kids out there who are transgender or feel like they are sort of grouped in the wrong gender category, but they don't have the supportive families, and so they cannot express their gender identity in the same way. And we probably would see some differences in how they identify or what their gender types preferences are, but it's really difficult to speculate on what those differences would look like or how big of a difference we would see because of the difficulty of accessing those kids.
Right. I mean,
yeah.
It makes a lot of sense. I mean, I don't want that to come across as too strong of a critique. I mean, there are literal legal barriers, for example, about when you have to when you're doing child-centric research, the parents have to consent. If the parents aren't supportive of the child, then they're not going to let them participate in the study. It's kind of like a chicken and the egg problem almost.
Right, exactly. And I mean, I think that's true to some extent for any research that we do with children. It's always a self-selective sample in that way. But of course, in this topic, it becomes particularly prominent that it's a self-selected group. So but in a way, we also want to study that group. So,
jumping off of that question a little bit, are there current projects or applications of this line of research that you're particularly excited about in the years to come?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, these kids are part of a longitudinal project. So the PNAS paper that came out at the end of last year was the culmination of all the data that we had from the first time kids participated in this study. But now we have at least 2 time points from almost all of our participants, and for some we have even more. So now we're working on some of these longitudinal papers where we can look at the stability of their gender identity and their gender type preferences, whether things change, how do they change, effects on mental health. And these are not all papers that I'm leading. We have a big team of people, again, under Christina Olson, who I was a postdoc with at University of Washington. So it's a big team of people who are leading these projects, but I'm really excited about seeing these longitudinal papers come out to see the effects. And I can't really say much about them right now because we're still in the process of analyzing the data. But I think those are going to be very interesting to see in the long run. Another thing is that we're working on is looking at how these gender non-conforming kids, so kids who have not socially transitioned, compare to the transgender kids. And one of the things that we're finding in a forthcoming paper, for example, is that the transgender kids do show more binary identification than the gender non-conforming kids. So when we talk about gender non-conforming kids, our sample is very heterogeneous, where we have some kids who do seem to show identity and preferences that are very clearly associated with a gender that's different from the sex they were assigned to at birth. But we also have some kids who seem to be very gender neutral in their identity and preferences. And so it's possible that these sort of different clusters of kids will show even more differences or continue to show these differences as they grow older. So looking at the longitudinal findings with the gender non-conforming kids as well is something that I'm really excited about.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a generative project. I'm sure we'll be teaching about the findings that come from it in many years to come. Last question. I do like to end these things, thinking more broadly about the field of intergroup relations research. What are the questions or the issues that you hope the field makes the most progress on in the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, so one of the projects that we also worked on a little earlier was how cisgender children perceive of transgender peers and how they evaluate them. And we do find that cisgender children do have some resistance toward transgender peers. So they do show some prejudice. And so I think this is certainly not limited to the issue of transgender versus cisgender identity expression. We know that children show very strong same gender preferences and sort of allyship when they're young. And it's possible that these lead to later power dynamics in our society. And so I'm really interested in trying to understand how we can structure early education and interventions to prevent these early discriminatory beliefs from becoming solidified and strengthened as children grow older and become active individuals in society.
Very cool. So many people who ask that question, they also bring up intervention work, but it's much more an adult population. And so it certainly seems to be earlier among a child population and see also positive and lasting effects into adulthood. So no argument from me about that. That's a valuable direction for this line of work. So with that, I just want to say thank you so much for your time, Selin. I really appreciate it. And it was great to chat with you.
Great. Thank you so much.